Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 53 of Circle of Fellows. This is a monthly broadcast panel discussion featuring 4 IABC fellows, whom you see before you, and me. I'm also an IABC fellow. I'll be moderating the panel. I'm Shel Holtz. I'm Director of Internal Communications at WebCore in San Francisco. I'll have our panelists introduce themselves in just a minute, but first I want to let you know that we will be answering your questions in real time. So if you have a question, please either submit it through the chat feature on YouTube. If you're watching directly on YouTube, just go ahead and use the chat and I'll see that and pass it along to the panel. You can also, if you're watching this where it's embedded somewhere, you can use Twitter and the hashtag COF53. That's for Circle of Fellows episode 53, COF53. And I'm monitoring that hashtag on Twitter as well. We'll pass your question along to the panel. Our topic today is transparency, which is a hot topic and has been for some time. But in the wake of the release of the Edelman Trust Barometer 2020, it's pretty clear that trust continues to be a huge issue, and transparency, as I'm sure we will talk about over the course of the hour, has a lot to do with how much people trust organizations. I'll throw out my definition of transparency, which actually isn't mine. It's from Don Tapscott, who wrote, I think, the first really important book on transparency called The Naked Corporation. But I'll do that after the panel introduces themselves. And I'm going to ask you to do that based on how you appear on the screen, starting with you, Martha.
Hello, my name is Martha Mazechka, and I'm a communications strategist based in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador in Canada.
And you've had some weather up there, Martha.
We have, and so in the interest of transparency, we've had more than 3.5 feet of snow, and we are in our 6th day of a state of emergency. So we've become quite good friends with all our neighbors and enjoying some brilliant sunshine, benefits of the post-storm aftermath.
Well, stay warm indoors. Jim, you're up next.
Thank you. I'm Jim Schaefer. I had my own consulting firm for the last 20 years. We focus on improving the performance of an organization through strong leaders and highly engaged, turned-on people. And
then Brad.
Hi, Brad Whitworth, SCMP IABC Fellow. I am an Internal Communications Manager at Hitachi Vantara in Santa Clara, California, and enjoy getting together with my circle of fellow friends.
I enjoy it too. Cindy?
Hi, Cindy Schmieg, SCMP. I am in the academic area right now, teaching as an adjunct professor in graduate communication program after spending a long career in corporate and agency communications.
Outstanding. Well, we have a great panel to talk about this. I know there's also internal and external experience in play, which I think is important because transparency goes to both of those sets of stakeholders. Let me throw out that definition as a point of discussion. Don Tapscott says, and I'm paraphrasing because I haven't pulled out the book to get the exact wording, that transparency is providing access to people, information, and resources that stakeholders need in order to be able to make informed decisions. And I think that's an important definition because it doesn't mean throwing open all the doors and windows and exposing every little bit of corporate data to the cleansing light of the sun, which is what a lot of people think it does mean. I'm curious what you think about that definition, if you have others that you use.
I think I would take a little step further than what he did. He was talking more about informed decisions, but I think more so is, do you make the right decisions that enable the organization to perform at a higher level at a cost that's lower than the gain you create, ROI? So I think it's more than informed decisions, but you do something with it. You create better performance.
Yeah, the other piece that I like about that is this whole notion of the people on the receiving end deciding what information they need. Because I think for a longest time, communications people have been put in the position of playing God, because we controlled content and we controlled channels, and we decided what it is that people needed to be able to make those informed decisions. And I think what I'm hearing in Don's definition, I think maybe the move toward is allowing the recipients of information to be sitting in judgment of what it is that they need to be able to do their jobs better, to be able to make better decisions.
Yeah, and to be able to go retrieve that information rather than wait for somebody to broadcast it.
Right.
And I think the question around access is really important, because if you look back, when I first started working in communications, we would have news conferences, we would prepare information packages, there would be technical briefings. So that information was already massaged in some way, because we had to prep it, to format it, to produce it, to make sure we had sufficient copies, etc. Now we look at self-publishing, we look at social media channels, we look at web pages. Things can go up and go down in a matter of seconds. So how we produce information and where we store it online so people can access it raises another level of question in terms of how people then get to that. If they couldn't get to news conference, how do they get the information now if they don't have internet, if either weather goes out or what have you? So in terms of access, I think that has also changed, and we need to look at what we mean when we give people that information and where we store it and house it so it can be retrieved easily in the future. If people need to have a closer look at how a decision was made based on the information available at the time.
I mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer, which for well over a decade now has been evaluating levels of trust that people have in 4 types of institutions. If I can remember them all, it's media, government, business, and NGOs. And essentially none of them are trusted right now for a variety of reasons. Depends on which institution you're looking at, but how does transparency contribute to trust?
That's Edelman Trust Barometer that just came out shows that integrity, dependability, and purpose drive 76% of the trust capital of a business. So I think the amount of transparency a company has and the information that they share allows people access and ability to make decisions on the company's integrity, dependability, and purpose. But there's also another interesting study that I saw come out of the University of Minnesota, and it deals more with CSR, corporate social responsibility. But in that study, it shows that transparency around CSR initiatives contributes to the integrity of an organization, but it does nothing for the credibility of an organization. So I thought that was kind of interesting that those 2 studies align in that credibility is only, or competence is only 24% of trust as a driver.
Yeah, and I think among those 3 characteristics that you listed, Cindy, integrity and dependability don't necessarily have to have something to do with corporate social responsibility. This could be dependability in terms of the quality of your products. Integrity, basically integrity means that you're walking the talk.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think transparency, making resources and information available that reveal how you are dependable, how well you are doing, what steps you are taking to improve and the like, sort of opening those books can help raise the level of trust that people have in your organization.
Shell, I completely agree with you. I think one of the most trusting environments that I have worked in over the years is in open book management companies. I don't know how familiar your viewers are with open book management, but it's about 30 years old. It was created originally by Jack Stack, who wrote The Great Game of Business. I have worked a lot with open book management companies and with Jack Stack, and I've taken my clients to Springfield Remanufacturing in Missouri, where they get exposed to that. And the people are, when you walk in the door, you have to learn the cash flow statement, the income statement, and the balance sheet, how it works and how you influence it. And your rewards are tied to it. everything you do is tied to it. So you have a group of people there who are so brought together, almost like a great football or baseball team is, where people trust each other because they're all headed for the same thing. And they don't give up the information because, I mean, think of it. Let's take a football analogy. You have a lineman is not going to give away the play that's coming up, the offensive lineman to the defensive lineman, because I'm going to get hurt, I'm going to get killed, or I'm going to cause the other guy to score the point for me. So in open book management, where it really is very, very transparent, you have huge trust.
I think the other thing that I would add on top of that, Jim, is the notion of consistency. Because I think that there are people who are open when it's convenient and a little bit more closed when it's not convenient. And so this idea of you're on the team, you're a player on the team, we want you to be, it has to be a consistent thing, and it can't be switched on and off at will. That's
right. And that's why in open book companies, you have very consistent mini huddles, you have scoreboarding. Everybody once a week comes together around that scoreboard. We talk about where we are, what we accomplished, what we need to do, who needs to do it. That team stays very, very aligned throughout the entire process.
Let me throw a question at you. This from Mary Beth West. You should be able to see it on your screen. I see it on mine. But can competence and ethics be mutually exclusive? That is, isn't any ethically corrupt organization inherently incompetent about the lack of sustainability corruption poses? Thoughts on that?
I never thought of it. Right.
I kind of think of that in terms of, if you can't promote a bad product to be successful. If you have a bad product, it's a bad product. The same thing. If you're a company and you are ethically corrupt, your communication isn't going to get you out of that. Being transparent is not going to get you out of that. So it is, they're linked, definitely.
Right. But being transparent, let's move away from an ethically corrupt organization and one that just makes a bad mistake, or has an ethical lapse. Thinking, I think probably the most current example is Boeing. Which is definitely in trouble. Their share price is tumbling. They've just recently suspended production of the 737 MAX. And they keep finding new problems. One of the challenges I find organizations have in a crisis, I think we can all agree that what Boeing is facing right now qualifies as an organizational crisis, is that they keep information to themselves and then it comes out, so that the story cycle just continues to repeat over weeks and months. So one of these that I recall that was a really big deal was the Toyota sudden acceleration issue, where they said, that's it, we've put all our cards on the table, and then a month later something else leaks. And this just went on for 9 or 10 months so they never left the news cycle, as opposed to just putting all their cards on the table and saying, we're going to be completely transparent about this. And sorry, I forgot to silence my phone. I did with my cell phone, but not the landline. I still have a landline. I'm so ashamed. Do you agree? I mean, when you were in a crisis, and I know that lawyers are there to minimize risk and they're going to counsel that you not say anything. But isn't it best to get all of your cards on the table and be done with it, so that you can start to move beyond it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, how many times have you been around somebody who's holding back information? To what extent can you trust that person? I believe for many years, starting when I was a governor's press secretary in Kansas, where making ourselves vulnerable actually built more trust. And that is, we were out there, we were very open. We were open with people about our flaws and our faults. And people would say, oh, I don't want you to feel that bad about yourself. I really love you. I really love you. So sometimes just being vulnerable, being very, very open says an awful lot, instead of what Boeing is doing right now is they're very close-lipped. Do you trust?
I think, Jim, what you were saying earlier in terms of open book, management and being open to also not just disclosing information, but that vulnerability and admitting the mistakes in the error and how you're going to correct that. I think about the CEO of Maple Leaf Foods, how he said, I want to talk to my communications people because I want to speak not only to the company people, but I also need to speak to our stakeholders, the buyers, the consumers of our products, because their trust is eroded and people had died and were seriously ill. So I think that when we look at trust and how people behave in a crisis, that is not the time to keep your cards close to your chest. I mean, once people start digging, if there are more skeletons to be hauled out of the closet, they are going to be discovered. People are becoming much more savvy about information, or they're getting in touch with people who know how to read or analyze technical information. To me, when I hear about the emails that have been released around Boeing, is that people knew about this problem, they were sharing the information about the problem, and there was still a failure to act responsibly and ethically in addressing the problem that they had with their product. So I think there's a huge challenge to trust if people are continuing to hide things.
And clearly that's the case, but also let's think, in a large organization, it's always difficult to find all of the information that may be relevant to a particular case or a situation in real time, and to be able to be done, say, oh, I found everything and put it on the table. I think just as all of us as communications people say, cascading information doesn't always work because some managers don't communicate down and out as well as others do. I think the flip side is true as well. A lot of people don't move information up with sort of equal speed or equal openness to sort of their senior leaders. They don't want to look bad. They don't want to make their teams look bad. They sort of withhold this stuff, trying to be a little bit secret. And so it does come out, but it takes time to pry it from every place. And I applaud the people, the few who have to try to piece the pieces together to be able to tell that full story. So it's not something that can be done overnight. But I think the point that all of us would agree is that once you get most of it, you better be sharing it. Otherwise, it's going to come out no matter what. And it may not be a positive story if you're not the one helping shape and frame the story and make those connections of the dots for the audiences.
Brad, I completely agree with you. And I think that's one of the things about the whole lean operation with continuous improvement, that if you are, quote, caught holding back information or sharing the wrong information, that you're effectively punished. We don't do that in this culture. We share information in this culture.
Culture, I think, is an important word to apply here. A culture of transparency, since the definition of culture that I have always liked is it's just the way things are done around here. I was mentioning before we went live that in the book I co-authored on transparency with John C. Havens, we interviewed Michael Hyatt, who is the CEO of a publishing company, and he had said, we're a private company. We're not obligated to share anything externally, but we have decided that rather than take the approach of assuming that everything is secret and then deciding what we're going to release, we're going to start with the presumption that everything is open, and we're going to decide what we're not going to make available publicly. So, he made a decision that sales figures would be advantageous to competitors, and we're not going to share those. But profits and earnings, we're fine. Even though we don't need to share those, we will, because there's no reason that we can think of not to. So that just became the culture around there. If something was going to be kept secret, you had to have a reason. Competitive advantage, it violated employees' privacy rights, whatever it might be.
And I think the point that both you and Jim are making is you need to have that culture where everybody is playing by the same sets of rules and everybody understands what's in bounds and out of bounds. A lot of companies go through putting this is company confidential, this is company private, this is this, and trying to classify information. And I would guess that while they would love everybody to understand those definitions and understand, most employees don't pay any attention to that. Most don't understand what's the kind of stuff inside that you can use, one that you can use outside. I still remember one of my days at Cisco, John Chambers, who was a penultimate CEO, leader, communicator, he would get on a worldwide employee broadcast and say things like, I'm going to share this with you, but I hope that it'll stay within the Cisco family. And then he would go on to disclose something. Well, he's talking to tens of thousands of people around the world, so the likelihood of it staying internal was a risk that he would take. Usually the stuff that he would share would not be the kind of earth-shattering stuff that would send a federal group in to do some sort of an investigation because of violation of SEC rules or something like that. Yet still, I think that communicating what is the culture, what's the expectation, what can you share, is something that needs to be explicit these days because a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, I've heard the tale that Facebook, and I know that Facebook is under a lot of fire right now, but this is something that I like about their culture is that Zuckerberg and his top lieutenants will get on company-wide broadcasts and reveal some very sensitive information. And when asked why that information doesn't get disclosed, employees say, because if we disclose it, they're going to stop sharing it. That's the culture in the organization is we're trusted with this, but if we violate that trust, they're going to stop trusting us.
I have an exercise that I use with leadership teams, and it starts with wanting to know how our communication culture is going to look and what are we going to do in this culture. And one of the exercises that I use is I start with 1 to 10 on a big flip chart, and then 1 is no trust, 10 is high trust. And I ask them, what would they hold back or not share? And most often they say, well, we wouldn't hold back anything. And that's when I say to them, well, let's just say Henry here, your CFO, gets caught with his hand in the till. What that means is you're going to communicate that to the organization that he's been terminated because he stole from the till. Oh, no, we wouldn't do that. No, well, wait a minute. You just said you were a 10. You wanted to be a 10. And I use that then to get them back down to what is realistic, because we wouldn't share it because we're going to hurt his feeling, his family, and tear him apart. We don't do things like that to people. But we also don't communicate widely. How do we communicate in those situations? That's a really good way I've found to try to identify what are we willing to share and what are we not willing to share.
We've had discussions where I work about sharing salary information. There are organizations that do it. Jim, you pointed out earlier that Gore, W.L. Gore has been doing that for many, many years. A lot of organizations would just be horrified at the idea that we would make available a list of what everybody is earning. But that's a form of transparency.
And it's a decision that needs to be made. What are we going to share and what are we not going to share?
A comment from Mary Beth I'll share with you. Transparency in organizational policy and personnel is also important. An actual case example, a 501c3 trade organization whose board votes to conceal who is on its audit committee but fails to notify members and refuses to answer questions.
That's an easy one.
Well, elaborate, Jim. Easy how?
Well, my point is that it's quite obvious that it's important to be very much aware of what you can and want to and need to share in order to perform at higher levels. And why this is an example of holding back information that generates distrust among people. You may have been trustworthy when you did it, but the perception of you is not that you're trustworthy.
Well, Jim brings up a great point there, though, about that using his exercise, because it gets to the intent of sharing the different pieces of information. And without, you need to look at all of those different pieces of information so that the information you share adds to people's ability to reason or think about the company or in providing context of what's going on, not just looking at the individual pieces of information separately. It's more about intent.
Right.
And just to belabor the obvious, there are things you simply cannot share. You cannot share your employees' health records, for example, in most countries. Mm-hmm. You have to comply with privacy rules, privacy laws that exist. They've just gotten more stringent here in California as of the first of the year. So transparency really doesn't mean we're going to make everything available. Question though, how do you start to create that culture of transparency? And second question, we can address both of these simultaneously, is what tactics do you employ in order to be more transparent? What does an organization actually do if they make the decision, we need to be more transparent? I have to tell you, I had a CEO once who came back from a conference and he said, I went to this session about learning organizations. We're now a learning organization. And I said, great. What does that mean? He said, it means we're going to learn. I said, okay, how? How do you measure that? And he said, we're just going to be a learning organization.
Well, Shel, one of the things you mentioned earlier was with the publishing company, the private company, and the discussion around the secrecy has to have a reason. And so using Jim's exercise in terms of how trusting what you would share and what you would do, then what would be the rationale? How do you communicate the reason for that secrecy? Is it because you will do damage to your competitive ability in the marketplace? Is it because if you share information about employees' health records, then that you're violating their individual privacy? So getting people to think about the reason rather than just because, or I don't feel like it, or whatever. Like, to me, I think people want to know the why behind you do something when you're an employee. Why do I have to keep this record? How long do I have to keep this record for? If I write this in an email, can this be information that can be accessed through public disclosure legislation? If we just say to people, do like this, but without giving the reason why, I don't think that they can then integrate it and live that practice in an authentic way, because they're just following an edict without really understanding the context, which is where we started off in the first place with your definition.
And Martha, I think you also have to go a step beyond that, which is to have this become a continuing dialogue. I think the standards are changing, the rules are changing, the methodologies are changing, the information access that we have are changing. I remember many years ago at Hewlett Packard, Bill Hewlett saying, welcome sharing information about what it is that we're making with even a competitor. Take him on an assembly line and show him that. He said, but I'm not going to tell you what I'm thinking about making. So he was very, very open about some things, but less so about others. That may change today when technology allows you to reverse engineer things and build things a whole lot more quickly than maybe 2 or 3 or 4 decades ago when development cycles were years and years. And I think the other thing we're seeing is a pendulum swinging. It's sort of, when things become too closed in terms of information sharing, the push is to more openness. And then at a certain point, oh my God, look at the information that's out there and we need to protect our privacy. Too much information is not necessarily a good thing. So we're going to see this, and it requires then constant communication to figure out what are the rules we're playing by and the why behind it, as you point out, Martha.
I think, Brad, you're absolutely right. I think one of the things we need to think about, though, let's say, and I was just thinking as you were mentioning that, Brad, is that let's say that a CEO called me and said, we need to be more transparent. We want to be a more transparent organization. The first thing I'd think of, I don't know that I'd use this language with her or him, but I would ask them what business they're in. Are they in the business of sharing all the information, transparent? Are they in that business, or are you in some other business where perhaps if you did a force field analysis, you'd identify lack of transparency is causing them to underperform? I don't think I'd lead with transparency. I'd lead with results and value. Then I'd back into that and say, to what extent is the transparency or the lack of transparency causing us not to perform where we should? That's what the shareholders, I think, would probably like too.
So transparency is a solution,
Yes.
not the problem itself.
Yes, because you're not even, if you don't know anything other than we're going to be transparent, then you don't really know what to focus on, where the underperformance is coming from and why. So you just start being transparent and hope like hell that the business gets better. But you could also be spending so much on transparency that the return you're getting is not sufficient. And you spend more money, the cost is greater than the value you've created.
Transparency, obviously, leadership has to take the lead
Yes.
for an organization, but there would be a role for communication practitioners. The first thing that comes to my mind, and being an internal communicator, that's where my mind goes first, is providing channels that make it easy for employees to get the information they need when they need it, whether it's data or a policy, whatever it might be. I know where to go to get that, and it may even be a channel where you can ask an executive a question and have the communication function facilitate getting the answer back as in as timely a manner as possible. What else do you see as the role of the communication professional, either internally or dealing with external audiences?
I guess one of the things that I'm seeing is the recognition that the best information is that's at the fringe of the organization, the people who are closest to the customers, the constituents out that way, and a recognition that sort of the power and the information resides at the edge, not at the center. We need to put in place the systems that allow us to acknowledge that, to take advantage of that. And I think we're getting there. I mean, the whole notion of user-generated content internally, allowing people here, there, and elsewhere in the organization to contribute content as opposed to everything having to be going through a central location. I know Jim historically talks about the power of communications within work groups to be able to resolve business issues and come up with results. I think there's a shift that's going on that whole information as a power thing. And I think we see it in I'll call it the communication network structures that exist in the world. It used to be everything was kept in certain central databases, and now it is in servers, it is sensors, it's everything spread across the world. So a recognition that no longer are we necessarily the ones who control or have insight into all of it, that information is distributed. And I think that means that we need to, in a sense, relinquish some control and worry about more the environment and the channels and making sure the structure is in place and the culture for sharing, as opposed to being the ones who decide which piece of information gets shared with what people, when, and where.
Yeah, Brad, I agree with you. I think that the communication practitioners have an opportunity for a new role to play. Instead of focusing on activity, I think they need to be focusing much more on results and value. And the way you do that is you step back and you say, where are communication breakdowns causing us to underperform? Where are we getting mixed messages between the reward system and what leaders are saying about whatever the subject is? Inaccurate information, slow-moving information. Where are we hurting as a business as a result of these communication breakdowns? Those are probably not going to be solved by another brochure, but there are ways to bring people together to help identify solutions to those mixed messages and communication that's breaking down. So I think it's a very different issue, and communication people have a tremendous opportunity, as I've seen it with the people that I've been working with, where they're creating results that are significantly greater than the cost of creating those results. A lot of communication people are starting to add ROI that they never did before, and I hope that continues.
We have two comments from listeners. The first one's up on the screen from Brian. He's suggesting mail copies of the annual report to the homes of all employees, which I think is a great idea for organizations that produce annual reports. I imagine that there is a broad swath of employees who will flip through it and look at the pictures and set it aside. So I think that's a good starting point, but I think you also need to be more proactive in sharing that information. And Jim, in the open book environment, it's which data from within the annual report is relevant to me on my job. What do I need to know in order to have an impact on the organization, or to make sure that my efforts are aligned with the business's objectives? The other, and I mean, anybody have other observations for Brian?
Well, I think the issue around annual reports is, what are the stories that you're telling and what is the manner? So if you present a financial report, do you have to be an accountant to understand what the numbers are telling you? Or can you present that information in a way that's clear and accessible so that people can understand what's happening with the bottom line? Too often I find that we have lots of information out there, but we assume that the audience who's reading it is at the level that of the people who generated the information, and there's a disconnect. Sometimes I look at something and I say, well, I speak English and this document is written in English and I'm pretty well educated, but I still don't understand what's being said here. So I think that we can have information, but if it's not presented in an accessible manner, it actually means nothing to people in terms of being able to use it. And so to me, I think it's a role in communications. When we tell the story of our companies and tell the story of the activities in an annual report or any other reporting function we may adopt in our organizations, that we understand the purpose and the reason and how we're telling that story, as well as the actual what and the content that's contained within it.
Yeah, I'm fine with people having an annual report, but I would hope that in my organization, if I had an organization like we're talking about, that the annual report information would be historical. That to me would be, well, we already did that. You know, I helped cause that number. I know what the cash flow, the income statement, the balance sheet are, because I affect it every day. I'm in huddles every day where we talk about where we are from a financial perspective. If I want to share what I do with my children, then maybe I want to give them an annual report and let them see that historical book that I helped cause to happen.
Well, I think you point out that the problem, if there is one with an annual report, is that it's a rearview mirror kind of thing. And I think a lot of people want to know, well, what's happening today and where are we going? And something like that is, it's also not only just the facts and figures, as Martha's pointing out, but I think there's the context. You know, tell me what this means to me. It doesn't necessarily mean that senior leaders have to provide that information all the time. It also could be middle managers, first line supervisors who have to be able to understand the big picture and then make that connection between what we're trying to accomplish as a big organization and what our role is in making the organization successful. And I think communications people can help in creating that environment, doing some skills training, getting people ready to be able to help supervisors all the way on up connect the dots.
I think it's also a question of knowing what employees are interested in knowing. For example, do people understand how others in the organization get promoted? Or is that a black box? Why did that person get that promotion? As opposed to, well, we do a quarterly calibration exercise. It's very objective. You know, we're very transparent about the process that is employed in order to determine who's going to get that promotion. But if that's not an issue, people aren't concerned about that. You don't need to. I mean, you want to make that information available for people who are looking for it, but it's not something you need to be pushing out there. What are people looking for? What are people talking about? What issues do people have? And we're going to get that information out there. One
of the funnest exchanges I had was when I was in Springfield, Missouri, at Springfield Remanufacturing. That's the home of Open Book Management, where it started. And over the years, I've taken a number of clients there. In fact, we developed a program, a day and a half, 2-day program, where they get to see what's going on in an open book company. They learn about it. They talk to employees. They talk to the leadership. I took my client out on the floor, sort of a garage type of an environment. And there was a guy there, kind of a grungy guy, but really a super person. And I had met him the last time I was there. And he said, "Jen, great to have you back." And I said, "Hal, what are you doing now?" And he says, "Well, we're trying to get this product over here on this truck because it's 23 cents less than if we wait for another hour and put it on that truck after that truck is gone." And he started talking about the income statement, the cash flow statement, and the balance sheet. He started sounding like an accountant to me. So it's that kind of thing that people are looking for. What is the kind of information that I need to do my job better so the company performs better and I'm able to keep my job?
Mary Beth has an interesting question, which is essentially, if I have information about the organization that should be the organization should be transparent about this. At what point should one become a whistleblower? Yeah, I guess my answer to that would be that that's a personal judgment that you need to make. I'm not sure there's any kind of a scorecard or defined threshold. Any thoughts?
I think that concept of whistleblowers is craziness. I wouldn't let it go on in my company. I want people to be open and honest with each other and to be able to, without fear, to be able to step forward and say, there's something going on here that doesn't work well. That is a much better culture.
I would be willing to bet that Mary Beth is talking about an external situation where a customer or a shareholder or somebody else has this information. In a membership organization, it might be a member who knows something that the board is privy to but has not been disclosed.
Mm-hmm.
So
and some of that is, I think, just as we encourage people to have direct questions, before you go and complain to somebody, have you had a conversation with the person that's causing an issue? So have you asked for the information in a straightforward way? And if the information is not made available, then how do you want to escalate the thing? And the whistleblowing can be anything from wild things to just, let's tweet about this and see how an organization responds, because maybe that's the way that the information will come out. And it gets back to what is the rule today for that sort of information? Is that something that can be released? And I think the other piece that I keep thinking about is how widely these vary from industry to industry. And Jim asked, what business are you in? And there are varying degrees of transparency and regulation put in place by all sorts of government agencies. And the rules that might apply at a bank in terms of transparency and information could be way different than what you see in a healthcare organization or a major transportation organization. So I think that not everybody has to play by the same rules. And we as communicators need to be smart to be able to ask, where are the boundaries? Are we pushing them enough so that people are able to make those smart decisions that we talked about from Don Tapscott at the front end?
Yeah, I want to share this comment from Mary Beth that anticipating what stakeholders want to know, since not all stakeholders value all of the same information. And I think this gets back to that idea that we have already determined what information we will not disclose. So when somebody expresses interest in some information, we don't have to have a conversation about whether we are going to make this information available. It's just a question of what's the best way to get that out there so it addresses the question or the issue. I do want to share this question from Brian Kilgore. Does IEBC tell its members how many members there are and what the numbers are for the past 5 years? I can share what I know, and that's at every year at the World Conference, there's an annual general meeting which is open to the public and it's open to the press. And those numbers are revealed there. They get published. I mean, sometimes PR News or one of the other publications is there, and that stuff gets published. But there's no attempt that I'm aware of to hide that. And every year it is available. So somewhere you could go find a 5-year record, I'm sure. I don't know if I could go find that on the IEBC website, but they don't keep that a secret. Brad, did you have anything to add to that? Chair?
Same thing. And I remember when I was chair, we would produce an annual report that went into all sorts of things. And the finances were also pretty publicly disclosed as well. It's there. Whether or not you can pull up a chart that shows you a line graph of what the membership is from over the last 5 years, my guess is no, not easily. However, the data is available. So.
Yeah, if you called, you'd get it.
Yeah,
you would.
Yeah. What are some of the best practices for transparency in organizations? What have you encountered with your employers or your clients or in your past lives that you would say is a best practice?
I think one of the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, the having people learn the cash flow statement, income statement, the balance sheet before they even go onto the floor, whatever kind of floor they're on, is number one. Number two is on a daily, hourly basis, have regular mini meetings, have huddles and scoreboards. They're all very prominent, whether it's the legal department or it's operations. Constantly every day sharing information, where we are against plan, where we are against our goal, in the openness books out there. That's what they do, and that's why they're so successful.
I would say aligning the leadership and employees within the organization, and some of the things Jim just mentioned would help to do that and provide the culture of transparency. But making sure that the understanding of transparency at the top is the same at the employee level is really important.
Yes.
What about the idea of empowerment? Does it need to be the leaders of the organization who present the information that people are interested in, or can employees be informed or just understand intuitively, because it's part of the culture, that they can share information? They can share information with their employees. They can share information with outside stakeholders who contact them and are looking for it, that they don't need to, elevate this 5 levels in order to get an answer to somebody.
Absolutely not. That's what I was just saying a little bit ago, that in an open book organization where everything is open, there aren't people with secrets. People share information with each other all the time. Everybody knows where they stand against cash flow statement, income statement, balance sheet. And I'm not going to say that again, but bottom line is everybody talks about what they need to do next to take it to the next level.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Martha.
Well, I also think, to Jim's point, that people share information is that the information is accessible, it's understandable, it's also verifiable through evidence and also external analysis. So I think an organization that is open to, if they are looking at expanding or developing a new policy or what have you, that, bringing that outside view to help them make that decision and letting people know that that's happening, I think is also really important as a best practice. Because if you have the information, and I know that Jim has this information, and we can align our data so that we can then move forward and make decisions that will help support the organization in its goal, whatever that may be, I think it's really useful. But if people have to really dig, or it's hard to understand, or they can't double check or track back with the data that they have, it makes it very difficult to be able to do your job effectively if you are relying on that information to make certain decisions.
Well, just one thing, and I'll stop on this, but the one thing that is interesting is I've taken communication people to SRC, and we do this day and a half session. Every time I have taken, whether it's ITT Corporation or Conagra Foods or whoever it might be, taken the communication people there, they all walk out and they all say the same thing. I am blown away at the amount of information people have available to them to make decisions. Blown away. Every one of them has said that.
I think one of the other trends that we're seeing is so many companies want to turn their employees into social ambassadors and have them be spokespeople. We, for the longest time, that was sort of a controlled environment where only these select people in PR and industry analysts and relations were allowed to be able to speak publicly on behalf of the organization. And now we're seeing a keen interest in that, in large part because employees and their networks are powerful. And I think average employee, sort of through that Edelman Trust Barometer, are people whose credibility perhaps is even higher than some people who are in positions of authority. I think the secret to a lot of this gets back to sort of culture, tone, style, and that is back to something that I remember here Jim talking about, this whole walk the talk. We need to get leaders who exhibit this openness, this sharing. I've seen so many organizations put on town hall meetings where, we'll answer all of your questions. And then the answers that people get tend to be this vague, fuzzy, corporate speak kind of thing, as opposed to direct, great question, let me tell you, or I can't tell you that because, or, whatever. We need to get executives and employees sort of that like mind, so that they're coming from the same place, so that if I'm asked a question, I'll know what it is that I can and can't say, and I'll know how far I can go because I've heard the CEO do that same sort of thing. We need to get CEOs out on the front line. So,
Brad just froze up on us.
Oh no!
Oh well. There he is. He's
back. Good.
I just wanted to share a case study that I just love. This case study. It was during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, And the Coast Guard incident response team was responsible for that. They were the primary agency involved, and everybody sort of reported up to them. And they had the folks in the orange jumpsuits out on the beaches in Mississippi cleaning up the oil off of the beach. And a camera crew went up to one of them and said, how's it going? And he said, I'm not allowed to talk to you. You need to talk to the public relations representative at Coast Guard Incident Command. And that's what got broadcast on TV. So it looked like they were hiding something. And the commandant of the Coast Guard said, this is absurd. The guy on the beach cleaning up the oil knows how it's going and should be able to answer that question without checking with us. They wouldn't answer what's the plan going forward or what's happening in some part of this disaster that I don't have any knowledge about. But for things that I do have direct knowledge about, they're in my area of responsibility, I should be able to answer that question. So he actually changed the rules for the whole Coast Guard in terms of that kind of a question. If you know the answer because you are a subject matter expert on that, you should feel perfectly free to answer that question without coming to me. And if a branch of the military can have a policy like that, surely companies can.
Yes.
That type of information, like Jim and Brad were talking about, sharing information within a company, making sure all the dots are connected. When those conversations are happening within an organization, those employees are naturally going to take that information out and share it with their friends and family. It will spread to the community. And it isn't a really overt external communication mechanism, but it really works to get your local community behind you. And it isn't always this big decision about who's going to be our big spokesperson on this.
Here's a question. Here's a question for you, Brad. Is there a serious difference between Japanese and American management regarding transparency?
I think there is, and I think that's one of the interesting things around the world. I was fortunate to have worked in Asia Pacific and Latin America, to less degree Europe, for about a decade, and just seeing from country to country the different communication styles, in large part set up by the technology and also the practice. I would say that the Japanese culture, for example, in general, is a much more hierarchical, patriarchal kind of organization structure than many Western organizations. And so levels of approval and how one speaks is a little bit more guarded. But that is sort of, you can't instantly transplant a Western version on any society. It's over time. What I've also seen is within Hitachi, a lot of people looking, for example, at some of the best practices in places other than Japan, saying, we need some more of that in our management structure, in our management culture, in our direction. So I think as companies start to do business more globally, they look for some of these, how can we take some of these ideals and move them along? My very, very favorite was decades ago in Japan. While in the US we were issuing press releases and sending them out through Business Wire and all sorts of electronic mechanism, in Tokyo you would still hand carry a printed copy of your press release to a central news bureau where all of the reporters came, but that's because all of the media were located in downtown Tokyo. So it became one of those where the reporters would all get together and the press relations people would all get together in one spot because they could. Technology has now changed that, and they're following practices that much more look like what we would see in other parts of the world. So technology, changing standards for what is transparent, new ways of going about doing things. It's one of those where I think we just keep having to ask the question, is this the best thing to do right now for the situation we're in?
Brad, I saw a lot of that at Toyota, the Georgetown, Kentucky plant, where I did quite a bit of work there. There was a structure, there was honoring the boss to a great extent, which is a Japanese custom. But there was a huge amount of discussion about where we're going, how we're going to get there, openness on the floor of the organization in such a way that people, I felt, were always very, very much informed about what's going on here. But there was a structure at Georgetown with the leadership team.
I was working with the American division of a French company. And this was in the very, very early days of intranets. And the American division had launched an intranet. That's what my work with them was all about. And they went over to France to show the parent corporation what they had done. And one of the leaders of the company said, so I want to make sure I understand with an intranet, if somebody gets promoted and I'm on vacation, that announcement would be posted and my admin would learn about it before me. Is that correct? And the American communicator said, yes, that's correct. And the French executive said, that's not acceptable. So it really is culture change, isn't it?
Yes, it is, very much so.
Can anybody share any other good examples of a company that practices effective transparency? And I'd be looking for a good external example.
Yeah, I've got a few that I'm familiar with. Southwest Airlines, Harley Davidson, SRC, which I've talked about, Netflix, Navistar, Outback, and John Deere would be the ones that I would put forward.
Can you give an example of just one of those, what they're doing?
Well, I can't right at the moment what they're doing right now. They are implementing a lot of the open book concepts. All of them are. But I don't know the very specific things they're doing. I was talking to some people at SRC yesterday about these different companies.
Other examples? And Martha, I know I cut you off a minute ago, so did you have something else to share?
I think just to follow up about the internal communications that Cindy mentioned in terms of employees being empowered to speak. I mean, we talk about our work. Obviously, if stuff is confidential in terms of, personal, private information. But I mean, people will say, how was your work day today? Or what is it that you're working on? Or I hear you got a new job. The idea of being the ambassador for your company, that you know what you can speak to. And before we got on the call, we were just chatting about the sort of media focus du jour in Canada, with Trudeau the Prime Minister having bought donuts, not from Tim Hortons, a brand associated with Canada, but from an independent bakery in Winnipeg. And I was struck how on Twitter the company outlined what they do and how they do their work, and why they are proud to be an independent bakery, and why they were pleased that the Prime Minister chose to come to them to supply treats for the meeting or whatever was the context. So I think when people are empowered to share with each other in the workplace, they can understand and promote and share information about what it is your company does, and how they do it. And to me, the question about trust in a company, where we started with the Edelman report, it's a good place to start, because you can say, well, why do I trust this company, or why don't I trust this company? And then start working backwards in the same way that Jim has with his exercise, where you locate yourself on that barometer, if you will. Because I sit there and I think, okay, I trust company X. Well, why do I do that? Because they treated me well as a customer, or because I know people who work there and they're open about their work and how they do their work, within what it is, the reasons that they can share what they do. To me, it's that culture of openness, and being able to speak to what you do, obviously without violating certain restrictions around competitiveness, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, to me, that the empowerment of the employee in terms of being able to make decisions with the information that they have and how it supports the company is really critical. And, as Jim said earlier, are you being transparent because that's the fashionable thing to be now? The question a couple of years ago with the Copenhagen Zoo, that euthanized an animal, a giraffe, in public, they said, well, this is what our value is, to be open to the company. And then there were to the public. And then there were other people saying, well, I don't know, I quite go that far. But then, what are the limitations? So the San Diego Zoo is an example of how transparent they are about certain things, but why they say they're limited in other areas in terms of things that they do. So it's pretty clear about why and how.
Shell, I know we only have a few minutes or a minute or so, but for people out there who may want to know more about this concept that I've been talking about, Jack Stack's new book, which just came out, is Change the Game. I strongly recommend. Lots of examples of what different companies are doing in this area. I just wrote a review. It was just published on it. I think it's an excellent book. The original book is The Great Game of Business. That was written, I think, in 2003 or 13 or something like that. But Change the Game would be a very, very good book for communication people to be.
I didn't know he had a new book. I will look that up.
Came out in October.
Yeah, we are out of time. So I do want to let everybody know that episode 54, there it is. Episode 54 is scheduled for noon on Thursday, February 20th. That's noon Eastern time. The topic is the business impact of communication. And no surprise, Jim, you're going to be joining us on next month's episode. I think that's probably your favorite topic. Also joining us for that episode will be Priya Bates, Neil Griffiths, and Ned Lundquist. So it should be a rollicking hour of conversation. I want to thank all of you for the conversation this past hour on transparency. I feel like we could just keep going. But we can't. So I just want to offer my thanks. Also, as ever, our thanks go out to Anna Willie for all of the behind-the-scenes coordination, pulling the panels together, making sure that everybody knows where they need to be and when. Couldn't do this without Anna. So gratitude goes out to her. So thanks all. We'll be back next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.